All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first day of pandemic school. I hope you are awake and ready to learn. We've got a lot to cover today. So, what I want to do for our schedule, I want to go over the objectives. I want to cover a little bit of procedural stuff just so you know what you have to turn in and when. We're going to watch a video together and kind of commentate on it, and I'll add my thoughts and ideas. And lastly, you are going to read a short story that was a diary entry from someone from feudal Japan. So, sorry, I need some caffeine for the morning. Game plan for today. I can describe the lives of nobles in the Heian period of Japan. That was a period in feudal Japan just before what we studied, around the 1100s and a little bit earlier. And I can summarize info from ancient sources. This is going to be a very old primary source that we're reading. It's been translated into English, but it should be pretty easy for you to comprehend as long as you're paying attention. Now, Bellwork says learn to be a digital student. The reason I'm doing that is because this whole extended VLD thing, it's going to be a little bit out of the ordinary. It's going to be a little bit out of character. So there's going to be some things that we're going to try and do to make it better for you. Likewise, if you have any questions, suggestions for us, please let us know. It's going to be very hard for us to change things if we don't know what's working and what's not working. We don't know what's difficult, what's easy. So please, 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 communication with your teachers is going to be the best thing that you can do here. So the one thing I really wanted to point out, you're going to be able to see this this morning. It's going to get shipped out to you. There's going to be a schedule for the week. And on that schedule, there's going to be two important things. So let's look at like Monday right here. We'll try and zoom in on it a little bit. Monday right here, there's a section that says what is due today. And there's a section in here that says when will the teacher be live for help. And that doesn't just mean, available by email. That actually means when are we going to be available either in a chat room or sitting on Google Classroom answering questions immediately. When are we available? For me, it will be on Google Meet. And that information will be available for every class, and it will just kind of tell you what you need to do every day and when is the best time to sit and have a conversation with us about it. So for me today, you're going to have two assignments due. Both of those assignments, FYI, are on the same document in Google Classroom, so that should make it a little bit easier for you. You have a crash course video to watch and answer some questions about. That's going to be about the Heian period in Japan, and it says lectures pre-recorded in Google Classroom. That's the lecture or the video we're watching right now. Now, the other thing you're going to be working on is you are going to be answering some questions about a primary source, the Sarashina Diaries. And for this source, because it's a little bit long, because it's a little bit complicated, I am going to be available on Google Meet to discuss it with you in person. So at the beginning of each of these sessions, I'll send out a link that you can click on. And I'm going to be available at 10 a.m., noon, 1 p.m., and 2 p.m. to probably read that story with everyone and kind of discuss it. So if you have any questions, I'll actually be there. You can, raise your hand or say something on the camera and stop and we'll talk about it. So let's go ahead and look at Google Classroom because the assignment you're working on today is going to be titled The Heian Period, Sarashina Tales. And while you're working on that, the steps are right here. Number one, watch the crash course video titled Heian Period Japan. That's this one right down here. That's going to include Crash Course John Green talking, but it's also going to have me up here in the corner lurking and giving my own commentary. And then you're going to have this PDF right here that's going to be your reading, and then you're going to have those questions to answer. So before we watch the video, before we do anything else, let's go ahead and look at these questions just so we know some of the stuff we're trying to find while we are completing the assignment. So, says Sarashina Diary Encyclopedia and Video Notes. Use the attached reading and video to answer these questions. So, what were the years for Heian Japan? What year did it start? When did it end? When did Sarashina live? That was the author of the reading. When was she alive? What years? How many years did her diary cover? Who was more powerful in Heian Japan, the generals or the scholar nobles? So, the leaders of the military that we've been learning about so far, the shogun, or was it the rich nobles, the educated? Who was more powerful during this time period? What did the nobles do for fun? What other famous writer was from Heian Japan? And what did someone named Murasaki Shikibu, what did she write? What was it about? So what was the name of that famous work, and kind of describe it for me. So these questions are going to be from either the reading or the video, both of them. They are very spread out, so you are going to have to look at both. You're going to have to dig through both of them and find it. But hopefully I tried to make today's actual questions just short enough that you're not going to get overwhelmed while you're also dealing with all the tech stuff. By tomorrow, this should be pretty similar to what we're doing today. It should start to get easier for you. So let's watch John Green, see what he has to say. Oh, that's a lovely freeze frame. We'll go ahead and get started, and if I had anything to add, I will pause it, see if I can make any of his words easier for you. Let's go ahead and start.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to return to medieval times. Mr. Green, finally we get to watch jousting and eat with our hands and root for the Blue Knight. Yeah, no, me from the past. For starters, medieval times doesn't closely reflect Europe in medieval times. And furthermore, we're not going to be talking about Europe in medieval times, although we will be talking about kings and courts and aristocratic intrigue, but we're going to be talking about all those things in Japan. So discussions of Japanese history often focus on the Tokugawa period because it's got ninja and samurai, but much of the foundation of Japanese culture dates to the Heian period between 782 and 1167 CE.
So, just like John Green said, this is right before the Tokugawa period. This is right before the section that we've just studied. So keep in mind that all the stuff they're talking about in here, this is leading up to all of those civil wars, the daimyo and the shogun fighting for power, and eventually the creation of feudal Japan.
When I say Japanese culture, I do mean culture, because the achievements of the Heian period were primarily artistic, especially in literature. So for most of this episode, we'll be looking at cultural history as opposed to economic or political history. As a novelist and also a consumer of culture, I'm a big fan of cultural history. What I love about it is that it embraces the human imagination. I mean, you can't just make up economic theories. Just kidding, you can. Anyway, for our purposes, Heian culture is the high culture.
So the big focus of the Heian period is going to be, they're talking about culture. So it's going to be books, art, music, more so that kind of stuff, more than wars, more than what was the name of the guy in charge, more than, what was everyone's type of jobs, who was trading. We're going to be looking a lot more at the arts.
Culture of the upper class aristocracy, and obviously focusing on this tiny sliver of the upper class leaves out the experience of most Japanese people. But we know a lot more about the elite than we know about everyone else, because it was the elite who were doing all of the writing things down, and they were writing about the people they found the most interesting themselves.
So, while we go over this section, pretty much this whole week, there's going to be a theme. We're always going to be learning about rich people. We're always going to be learning about their fancy clothes, the cool things they did, all their swag. That's not because everyone in Japan was super wealthy. It's because the only people that wrote things down, remember, that's how we learn about history. We see or go over the things they wrote down. The only people that could write, the only people that could record history were the nobles. They were the only people that got to go to school. They were the only people with an education. And because of that, they were in turn the ones that recorded everything, and they really liked writing about themselves.
In fact, one of the reasons we know a great deal about the Heian aristocracy is because of Japan's first great novel, The Tale of the Genji by Lady Murasaka Shikibu. Now, the historian James Murdoch called the Heian aristocracy an ever-pullulating brood of greedy, needy, frivolous dilettanti, as often as not foully licentious, utterly effeminate, incapable of any worthy achievement. But when you boil all the unnecessarily fancy words out of that quote, that sounds like people I'm very interested in learning about. In fact, I love some foul licentiousness, so one of the first things we learn from texts about the Heian aristocracy is that the aristocracy was dominated by a craze for things Chinese. Now, Chinese visitors to Japan thought the country was backward and out of the way and uncivilized. But one of the reasons the Japanese seemed backwards to Chinese visitors is that the Japanese in the 10th century admired Tang China, which had flourished a couple hundred years earlier. But there was also the fact that the Japanese blended Chinese ideas, especially Chinese Buddhism, with native traditions. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of Heian Japan was the overall attitude of the aristocracy, which was characterized by a love of color and grandeur and ceremony and ritual that was tinged with some Buddhist-inspired ideas.
So, most of Japanese culture during this time period was inspired by Chinese culture from a couple hundred years before. That's why we're going to see a lot of things like Buddhism. We're going to see a lot of similar stories. We're going to see a lot of similar themes. We're going to see a lot of similar clothing. We're going to see the same religions, is because that Chinese culture, through trade, went across to Japan, and by the time it got to Japan, China was over it. But Japan's like, wow, this is really cool. I really like how these people act, how they talk. Let's try and copy it. And because of that, we're going to see a lot of similarities to Chinese culture here. Most importantly, Buddhism.
It's sort of like how everyone in Canada wears powdered wigs and knee breeches to look like 18th century England. And one of the central ideas in Buddhism is that everything beautiful, and also everything not beautiful, is fleeting. Like historian Ivan Morris wrote that in the literature of the time there was a, quote, feeling that the familiar order of things will soon come to an end. Which, by the way, is always an appropriate feeling. So the center of aristocratic court life was the capital, Heian-kyo, which during the Heian Golden Age may have had a population as high as 100,000 people, making it much larger than most European cities at the time. It may have been a glorious capital, but we don't really know because most of the city was destroyed by earthquakes, or possibly fires, or possibly wars, or just the desire for new construction. We're not sure. We also know that the Heian aristocracy was rigidly hierarchical, with society divided into about 30 grades based on one's birth. The top 4 grades were reserved for princes, and the top 3, known as the kugyo, received all the most important privileges, including governmental posts and revenues from special rice land. These people in the highest ranks could send their children to university, wear ceremonial dress. They were given lighter punishments when they committed crimes. Can you imagine a world in which rich people systemically receive lighter sentences for crimes committed than poor people?
So, we've talked about social classes, talking about some people being important, some people being less important. That was very, very specific in Heian period Japan. So they're talking about, depending on what family you were born into or how much money your family had, it could change what kind of school you got to go to. It could change what clothes you could wear. It could change what kind of jobs you could have, all the way down to people of a higher class were given less severe punishments if they committed a crime compared to, a middle class person or a lower class person would receive a more harsh punishment than the rich.
These rules were so detailed that they even determined what type of fan you could hold. The top 3 ranks got to hold 25-fold fans. But when the Tale of the Genji was written, this rank system, like all those ranks, applied to less than 1/10 of 1% of the total population. So we're really talking about the elites. As Ivan Morris put it, members of the upper class are almost all related to each other. They are totally uninterested in everyone outside their charmed circle and exceedingly sensitive in judging the precise social level of each person who does belong. In Murasaki's milieu, to determine a person's precise standing was no simple diversion, but a matter of overriding importance. Now, that description reminds me a lot of my high school experience. Aristocrats dominated the government, which over time became more and more ceremonial and ritualistic. In fact, by the 10th century, much government work was carried out at night and consisted almost entirely of ceremonies. The nice thing about doing boring ceremonial work at night, though, there was a lot of wine. So yeah, that doesn't make for, excellent government efficiency. Heian Japan's economy economy was not much better than its governance. There was very little trade, and an attempt at land reform, which was supposed to grant every citizen a parcel of public domain land, totally failed. Meanwhile, aristocrats accumulated vast agricultural land holdings, and by the 10th century, court nobles were largely supported by these tax-free estates called manors.
So what they're talking about is, over time, the economy got bad. People stopped trading. People stopped having jobs. People stopped making money. And what that led to was the wealthy were the people that were able to kind of get control of all of the land. And because of that, the nobles started kind of piecing out the land and saying, like, hey, you can live here. You just gotta work for me for free. And what we're seeing is the earliest versions of that feudalism. It was because the rich were taking advantage of the fact that the poor didn't have a lot of money.
Now, interestingly, the nobles didn't technically own the land outright, as they did in much of Europe. Instead, they owned the rights to income from the land, and then those rights could be transferred to their heirs. So it is similar to ownership, but it wasn't quite ownership. Also different from Europe, upper-class Japanese women could hold the rights to a manor, and thus have a rather impressive degree of economic power. And that matters a lot because women played a key role in the flourishing of Heian literary culture that makes this period of history so interesting to study in the first place. Like, overall, this inefficient, corrupt cronyism of Japan's government and economy definitely weakened the state, but it also provided time and money for the aristocracy to make beautiful and interesting things. Let's go to the thought bubble. Heian aristocrats were expected to feel melancholy over the transience of existence. In Murasaki's time, according to Ivan Morris, periodical protestations of melancholy and gloom were essential for people who regarded themselves as sensitive.
If you were sophisticated and smart, then you were supposed to be sad all the time because of how awful the world was. So basically, they were trying to say in Heian period Japan, you were supposed to be emo if you were going to be popular.
And sensitivity, especially to art, was the hallmark of aristocratic breeding. The aristocratic gentleman is exemplified by Prince Genji himself, quote, with his gentle nature, his sensitivity, and his wide range of artistic skills, who represented the ideal of the age and who set the tone for the social and cultural life of the good people. Buddhism was very influential on the aristocrats' aesthetic ideal that beauty must be cultivated because it is so impermanent. This quote from the Tale of Genji illustrates this focus on impermanence. Like the waterfowl that play there on the lake, I too am floating along the surface of a transient world. I couldn't help comparing them with myself, for they too appeared to be enjoying themselves in the most carefree fashion, yet their lives must be full of sorrow. Stan, are you sure that's from the Tale of Genji? I think I've seen that quote attributed to me on Tumblr. But we don't only know about the emotional state of the aristocracy, we also know about their pastimes. We refer to nobles as the leisure class.
So a lot of the things they're talking about right here will not only be important for your questions, they will also be really important for your assignment tomorrow because you're going to be asked to write about the perspective of some of these people. So one of the most important things you could write about is their activities. Here's a lot of the activities they did.
Class for a reason, after all. They spent a lot of time playing games and engaging in contests. Poetry contests were popular, as were board games like Go, and much of their time was taken up with ceremonies and rituals. Here is an example from the court calendar. 18th day. Bowman's Wager. The New Year's celebrations are concluded by an archery contest, which is held in His Majesty's presence between officers of the Inner and Middle Palace Guards. This is followed by a banquet during which court dances are performed and prizes awarded to the winning side. Members of the losing side are forced to drink the cup of defeat. Thanks, Thought Bubble. I'd like to make an announcement here at Crash Course. From now on, whenever we refer to anyone losing anything, we will say that they were forced to drink from the cup of defeat. So, other than pure Game of Thrones style drama, this highly ritualized, very insular social order of the elites isn't usually the kind of stuff we'd study at Crash Course. But first, thinking about the Heian aristocracy tells us something about the lives of the rich and powerful generally. Like, obviously they had to increasingly separate themselves from each other to feel more and more wealthy and powerful, which progressively led to them being more and more separated from, the vast majority of people living in Japan. But also, they produced and consumed cultural artifacts that came to define the style of the age, but also have continued to shape culture. Heian aristocracy and the documents that describe it tell us a lot about women, who, as we've seen, are often left out of historical narratives. The Heian period, at least culturally, was dominated by women, particularly Murasaka Shikibu and Sei Shonagon. So in some ways, at least, unlike almost everything we've studied, our view of the period is dominated by women's perspectives, although it is the perspective of the most privileged women.
So this is actually really different from what we've seen in other civilizations so far. What John Green is talking about is women were the ones that had the time, they had the experience, they had the intellect to work on art. So the paintings, the drawings, the scrolls, the readings, the novels, almost all of it during the Heian period of Japan was created by women. So the perspective of a lot of these stories that we are going to see is from the perspective of women. That's not something we saw in Egypt. That's not something we saw in Mesopotamia or India. So this is a huge sign, number one, of more gender inequality in Japan than in other places. But also this is a huge sign of, just in general, equality that we haven't seen before. Not saying it's perfect, but it's definitely better than most of their contemporaries.
And what we see is consistent with a lot of upper-class mores. These women are obsessed with their looks, and especially with their clothes, which were cumbersome and heavy. They were expected to wear their hair very long, preferably reaching to the ground. They had to powder their faces and blacken their teeth, and they lived the circumscribed lives typical of upper-class women throughout the world. Although there were some legal protections that they enjoyed. Like we talked about how they could have income from property. Laws also protected them from physical violence, specifically prohibiting a husband from beating his wife, which might not sound like that big of a deal, but compared to women's lives in Europe, that was a big improvement. And upper-class women in Heian Japan were all literate and educated, although their education was limited to the types of cultural skills that would make them attractive to men. Poetry, music, calligraphy, maybe some literature. Disciplines like history and law and philosophy were mostly off limits, and that brings me to something I want to talk about. All of these privileges, from the heavy, cumbersome clothes that make it difficult to move, to the kinds of education women could have, or the kinds of limited legal protections they could have, all of that is evidence of a patriarchy. So we see through these women's stories the way that they were able to express themselves and their philosophies and the way that they lived in the world. So women like Murasaki Shikibu lived constrained, cloistered lives, but of course there were opportunities available to them that weren't available to men. And that's what's so exciting about being able to read their narratives. We just don't have many equivalents to that in Europe at the time. That noted, these women, like their male counterparts, spent most of their lives indoors and communicated mostly by intermediaries or letters. Women couldn't show themselves to men or make conversation with them, but there was a great deal of interest and intrigue around love and romance, not least because Heian gentlemen were expected to be polygamous and also to engage in extramarital affairs. But just because sexual relations were often divorced from marriage and love affairs were common doesn't mean that they lacked
Dramatic. It's like a soap opera.
Emotional consequences. In the stories we read about Heian Japan, everybody is always worried that they're going to, fall out of favor with their lover, or their husband, or their whatever. It's so exciting to read about. I mean, I'm sure if you're living inside of it, it would make you very anxious. Also, when courtship and marriage had political dimensions, as they did in the highest noble ranks, women were often in danger of being displaced by a more advantageous match. And we know from the stories that all of this combined into pangs of jealousy and fear of being abandoned, and then pain when you actually were abandoned. And those kinds of stories, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, have a kind of universality about them. The last thing I want to say here is that power works differently when you're not in power, right? Like if you're a student in a high school classroom, the teacher has the power, but you have some power. And the most interesting thing about the story,
students can have a little power as a treat,
from the Heian aristocracy is the ways that women used the power that they did have to bring about change in their own lives and in their communities. So by looking at history through the lens of literature, we get a very different perspective than if we were to focus on government documents or archaeology or descriptions of war. This helps us to try to develop a sense of how people at the time felt, although we're only dealing with a very limited group of people, obviously. The cultural achievements of the Heian period, described and exemplified by the tale of Genji, were considerable, especially when compared to what Europeans were accomplishing at the time. And it's another reminder that we need to be careful when we talk about the 9th and 10th centuries as the Dark Ages. It's also interesting that the Heian period in Japan wasn't particularly successful politically or economically, but that it did lead to great cultural achievements. And almost all of the literary achievements were made by women, which, as Morris points out, is a rare, if not unique, phenomenon in cultural history. For Heian Japan, the historical record was written primarily by women. And while the Tale of Genji doesn't discuss politics or economics the way that we usually imagine them, and while it describes a world that leaves out 99% of Japanese people during the period, it has a lot to tell us about the way that at least some people felt and lived, which is more than can be said for a lot of history books. And that's a type of history that most of us can relate to more than stuff with generals and kings in it. For instance, when I look at the history of my own life, I find that generals and kings have played a very minor role. Jealousy, on the other hand, not insignificant. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is filmed here in the Chad and Stacey Emigold studio in Indianapolis. Thank you for watching, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.
All right. So, the big takeaways we saw from John Green. Number one, the Heian period, the biggest thing we're going to be looking at is their culture. So we're going to be learning about the things they did for fun, the way they dressed, the way they spoke. We're looking at their books, their poetry. It's really more of us looking at their everyday lives more so than like the big events that happened, specifically of the nobles. The other thing we're going to be having a huge focus on is the perspective of women, because once again, that's not something we've seen in a lot of ancient civilizations. In fact, the reading we're about to do is based on the diary, or translated from the diary entries of a woman who grew up during that time period. So the next assignment you're going to be clicking on is this one right here that says Sarashina Diary PDF, and that's going to be where you're going to answer the rest of your questions. Now, if we look at it in here, it's pretty long, but the reading is not that hard. It has been translated in a way where the vocabulary is not too difficult. It's easier than some of the other things that we have read. If you're struggling with it, I'd like to remind everybody that I'm available at 10 a.m., noon, 1 o'clock, and 2 o'clock to read it and discuss it as a group in Google Meets. So I will be sending emails with those codes if you want to join. If you have it done, you don't have to, work with me on Google Meets if you don't need to. You only have to go to one of these sessions. I'm not going to be talking about anything different at 10 o'clock than I am at noon. So you don't have to go to all of those. It's an option. So the diary entry is right here, and it's about a woman who goes out, originally lives kind of in a village on the outskirts of the capital, and it's decided that she needs to move to the capital for political reasons, to get married to a government official. And as we read through, it talks about her journey. It talks about kind of her experiences as a girl from the countryside, how she's scared to interact with all of these people, how she's worried that she's going to be thought of as, lesser than them, and about learning basically how to become a noble, how to become a member of the upper class. Halfway through her travels, she actually stops her diary entry. She writes about, or copies down a story, a folk tale from one of the towns she's staying in about an adventurer, Takashiba, right here. And so you'll take a little bit of a break. You'll learn about his adventures. This is, Japanese folk tales more so than a diary entry, talking about him going on an adventure. There's a princess, all that fun stuff. But as we go through, it'll finish off. She will finish copying down the story that she heard, and then it will go back to her traveling to the capital, and it'll be back to her experiences of, trying to get to where she's going to spend the rest of her life in higher class. So, when you're done reading this, remember that you have these questions to answer and submit into Google Classroom. If you need anything from me, please send me an email. If you need help immediately. If not, one of those 4 sessions where we're going to be discussing the story and kind of its implications. Please make sure that you pay attention to this assignment. Please get it done on time. Please make sure that you read and watch everything thoroughly, because tomorrow's assignment is going to be a creative writing project based on this work right here. So you are going to have to write something from the perspective of um, a person during this time period. The only way you're going to know about how they live their lives is by doing this reading, watching this video. Uh, this is going to be the first grades going into quarter 4, so these VLDs are going to have a huge weight on how successful you are, so you need to try your hardest. I'm making this assignment due by 8 p.m. tonight. That way, if you have any issues, you can get a hold of me, or if you need to, work at a relative's house after normal school hours because your internet's acting up, you can also do that. Remember, communication, take your time, be thorough, try your hardest. If an old person like me can figure all of this out, I think you can too. Best of luck, and if you need anything, please let me know. I will see you tomorrow.